The morning Samuel Holt died, the sky above Redstone was the color of old bone. Not white, not gray. That particular shade between the two that shows up in Wyoming in early March, when winter has spent most of its anger, but hasn't quite decided to leave. The kind of sky that makes everything beneath it look smaller than it is. The kind of sky that feels like a held breath. Clara found him just before sunrise. She had ridden out to the north pasture because the night before she had dreamed about him, which was not unusual, and in the dream he had been sitting on the limestone ridge above Black Hollow with his boots off reading one of his leather notebooks, and he had looked up at her with an expression she could not name but recognized. She woke before dawn with a feeling in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but something that sat between them the way that sky sat between white and gray. Ridge, her stocky bay mare, picked her way through the frozen grass without being asked. The horse knew the trail to the northern pasture better than Clara did. She had been making this ride since she was old enough to sit a saddle. 9 years old, maybe? 10. Trailing behind her grandfather on a gray gelding that moved like smoke across the hillside, watching him tap rocks with a stick and write things down in his small, precise hand. She found him sitting upright in the saddle. That was the detail that would stay with her. He had not fallen. He had not slumped. Samuel Holt had died the way he had lived, straight-backed and attentive, his left hand loose on the reins and his right hand holding the leather notebook open to a page covered in his careful notations. The gelding stood perfectly still beneath him, patient as stone, as if it understood that this particular stillness required respect. Clara pulled Ridge up alongside him and sat there for a long moment without speaking. There was nothing to say. The wind moved through the gap in the ridge above them, carrying the smell of cedar and cold earth. A hawk turned slow circles in the pale sky overhead. She reached out and took the notebook from his hand. She did not look at it immediately. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, the same way he had always done. Then she turned Ridge around and rode back toward town to find Sheriff Briggs. She did not cry. Not yet. There was work to be done first, and Samuel Holt had raised her to understand the difference between feelings and timing. Briggs was a lean, deliberate man who had been sheriff of Redstone for 11 years, and had learned in that time that the most useful thing a lawman could do was listen before he spoke. He rode back out with Clara without asking unnecessary questions, made his notes arranged for Samuel's body to be brought in with the dignity the old man deserved. When it was done, he stood beside Clara in the cold morning air and looked out at the ridge. He was a good man, Briggs said. He was the best man I knew, Clara said. That was all either of them said about it. Samuel Holt had built the Holt Ranch from a surveyor's kit and a geological education that nobody in Wyoming Territory particularly asked for or understood. He had come west from Ohio in 1848, 30 years old, with instruments in his saddlebags and a way of reading the land that other men found somewhere between strange and impressive. He had chosen every acre of the Holt holdings himself, not for what grew on top of them, but for what lay beneath them and beside them. Water access, mineral deposits, drainage patterns, elevation, and grade. He understood the land the way a doctor understands a body, not just the skin, the bones. His family respected him. They did not, however, understand him. Douglas Holt. Clara's cousin was 31 years old and ran the Holt warehouse near the rail spur with a ledger and a cold eye for numbers. He understood cattle prices and freight rates and the politics of who held accounts with whom. He was not a cruel man, but he was a certain one, and certainty in a man who has never been wrong about small things can look a great deal like wisdom until it meets something larger than itself. Uncle Garfield. Clara's father's older brother managed the South Pasture, 640 acres of good grazing land along a seasonal creek. He was a steady man, decent in the way that men are decent when life has not asked too much of them. He followed Douglas's lead on most things, not because he was weak, but because Douglas seemed to know where he was going, and Garfield had never been particularly interested in directions. Claire's father had been different. Wendell Holt had been a gentle man and a bad gambler, a combination that tends to end one particular way. He had sold off his share of the Holt holdings to cover debts accumulated over a decade of poor decisions made at green felt tables in back rooms, and he had died owing more than he left behind. The debts had been settled eventually, but the shame of them had not. It lived in the silence that fell over certain conversations when Clara walked into the room. It lived in the way Douglas looked at her, sometimes not with dislike exactly, but with a kind of careful accounting, as if he were calculating what she was worth against what she had already cost. Clara was 23 years old. She lived in a small house at the edge of town, took in mending, kept a garden that produced more than she needed, and rode Ridge out to the northern hills 2 or 3 times a week when the work allowed. Ash, her dog, went everywhere she went. He was a gray animal with amber eyes that made visitors uneasy. More coyote than hound, lean and quiet, and absolutely loyal. He had appeared at her door the week after her father's funeral, half-starved and silent, and had never left. People in Redstone said he looked like trouble. Clara thought they were judging the wrong thing. She was not pitied exactly. She was not disliked. She was simply not considered. A woman without land, without a husband, without a seat at the family table. The kind of person a town steps around without noticing. She had made her peace with that long ago because she understood something that the town did not. She had Samuel's notebooks, 14 of them stored now in the cedar chest beneath her bed. And she had Samuel himself for as long as she had him, which had turned out to be 23 years and not long enough. The night before the will reading, Clara sat at her kitchen table with the cedar chest open in front of her. It was not the chest from under her bed. It was a different one, smaller, made of the same Wyoming cedar, but older, the wood darkened with decades of handling. Samuel had given it to her 3 years ago, pressing the key into her palm without ceremony, the way he did everything that mattered. "Keep this," he had said. "Don't open it until after." She had asked after what. He had looked at her with that expression she could never quite name, and said, "You'll know." She had known. Inside the chest were the last 2 notebooks, the ones he had kept in his final years, filled with his careful geological surveys of the northern tract. There was a hand-drawn map she had never seen before, detailed and precise, covering the limestone shelf beneath Black Ridge Hollow with measurements and cross-sections. And, at the bottom, folded once, was a piece of paper in Samuel's handwriting. She recognized the date at the top. He had written it 10 years ago when she was 13, before her father had finished drinking himself out of the family holdings, before the shame had settled in, before any of what came after. The letter was not long. Samuel had never been a man who wasted words. The land speaks to those who know how to be quiet. You are the only Holt who ever learned that. What I am leaving you is not nothing, Clara. It is not sentiment. It is everything I know about this ground and everything I believe about what it will become. The men in that room will laugh. Let them. The truth is quieter than laughter and considerably more durable. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and put it back in the chest and sat with her hands flat on the table for a long time. Ash lay by the stove, his chin on his paws, his amber eyes half closed. He was watching her the way he always watched her, with the patient attention of an animal that understood more than it let on. He planned this, Clara said quietly. Ash's eyes opened a little wider. He knew exactly what he was doing. 10 years ago, he already knew. Outside, the wind moved through Redstone, the way it always moved through small Wyoming towns at night, finding every gap and loose board and speaking through them in a low, continuous voice. Clara thought about her grandfather at 13, the way he would stop his horse on the limestone ridge and sit absolutely still, listening to something she couldn't hear. She had asked him once what he was listening for. The land, he had said. It talks if you're quiet long enough. She had tried to be quiet. It had taken years before she understood that being quiet was not the same as being passive. It was active work. The discipline of holding what you knew without spending it too soon. Samuel had been teaching her that since she was 9 years old, and she had not understood what he was teaching until she was old enough to need it. She closed the chest and went to bed, but she did not sleep. The will reading took place on a Tuesday in the Redstone Courthouse, a room that smelled of wood smoke and linseed oil and the particular dry dust of Western legal proceedings. Judge Calloway ran a prompt court, and Walter Reed, the family lawyer, was a man who understood that the purpose of reading a will was to convey information efficiently and get home before dark. The room was full. Cattlemen who had done business with Samuel for 30 years, store owners who held Holt accounts, two distant cousins from Cheyenne who had not visited in 15 years but had arrived with impressive promptness when word of Samuel's death reached them. Briggs stood at the back wall with his arms crossed, his expression professionally neutral. Clara stood near the window. Ash was tied outside. She could hear him breathing in the shade. Reed read in order of asset value, which was the sensible way to do it, and also guaranteed that the room would be paying close attention by the time he reached the bottom of the list. The warehouse near this rail spur with its inventory and operating accounts went to Douglas. The South Pasture 640 acres with seasonal creek access went to Garfield. The livestock holdings were assigned to a 4-man partnership agreement Samuel had signed 6 months before his death, dividing them among the men who had worked the ranch since its earliest years. The house and its contents went to Eleanor Samuel's surviving sister with a provision for maintenance. There were smaller bequests, a saddle to Calhoun, the longtime foreman, the surveying instruments to the county land office, $300 to the First Methodist Church of Redstone. The room shifted slightly as Reed turned the page. The air had the quality of people who believe they already know how a story ends. Then Reed read the final clause. To my granddaughter, Clara Holt. I leave the northern tract 40 acres beyond Black Ridge Hollow, along with all rights and claims attached thereto. The room relaxed. Several men exchanged glances. Someone near the back laughed. It was Douglas. Clara knew his laugh without looking. It was not cruel exactly. It was the laugh of a man confirming something he already believed. Black Ridge Hollow was the worst land on the Holt survey. Rocky, uneven ground. Soil so thin you could see limestone pushing through it like old bones. Too far from town for practical use. Too steep for cattle. No timber worth hauling. A sentimental gift from an old man to a granddaughter he was fond of. Nothing more. Garfield leaned toward Douglas and said something Clara couldn't hear. Both men smiled. Reed folded the document with the careful efficiency of a man who had read too many wills to be surprised by any of them. He handed Clara her copy across the railing. She took it without a word, folded it once, and put it in her coat pocket. She did not look at Douglas. She did not look at Briggs. She walked out of the courthouse into the April sunlight, where Ash was waiting in the shade of the hitching rail. She untied his lead, coiled it, and stood for a moment with one hand on his rough gray fur. The laughter followed her through the courthouse door for just a moment before the heavy wood swung shut behind her. It sounded different from the outside, smaller, like something that had already begun to cost more than it knew. What most of them did not know, what few in that room had any reason to consider, was that Samuel Holt had not come to Black Ridge Hollow by accident. He had surveyed that ground with the same precision he brought to everything. 3 summers in the late 1860s, years before the railroad changed the map of Wyoming Territory, years before anyone thought the land north of town mattered for anything at all. He had walked every foot of it. He had tapped the limestone with his instruments. He had traced the grade of the ridge and the width of the natural pass at its southern end, 22 feet across, at its narrowest, with a slope of less than 3%, and bedrock solid enough to carry whatever load anyone might care to put on it. He had filed his findings with the county land office, quietly, without announcement. The papers had sat in a drawer that smelled of dust and cedar for 12 years, bundled with a frayed string, stamped with a date that nobody had any reason to look up. In the spring of 1872, the year Wyoming Territory passed its Mineral and Water Rights Act, Samuel Holt had walked back into that same land office and registered a claim. Mineral extraction rights across the full 40 acres of the northern tract. Water rights to the underground basin that sat below the hollow, fed by a spring that moved through the limestone shelf 30 feet beneath the surface. He had known about that basin for 3 years by then. He had identified it in the late 1860s by following the geological logic of the limestone formation, by noting the places where the rock stayed cool in July heat, by watching where the vegetation grew green in drought, years when everything else had given up. He had confirmed it with a shallow test bore in 1871 when he was 65 years old and still willing to spend 3 days on a hillside with a hand drill and a measuring rod. He had filed his claim the week after the Wyoming Territory Mineral and Water Rights Act became law. The ink on the legislation was barely dry. Samuel Holt had been waiting for that law the way a careful man waits for the right tool. Clara had known about the filing for 5 years. Samuel had taken her to the land office in the spring of 1879 when she was 18 years old. He had said nothing in advance about where they were going or why. He simply arrived at her door one morning with both horses saddled and told her to bring a coat. She had learned over the years that when Samuel told you to bring a coat, you brought a coat. At the land office, he had spoken briefly with the woman at the front desk, a composed and precise woman named Mrs. Alderton, and she had disappeared into the back room and returned with a bundle tied in frayed string. Samuel had laid it on the counter and unwrapped it slowly the way he did everything. He showed Clara the original survey filings, the mineral rights registration, the water claim, the notation in the margin of the water, claimed that she would not fully understand until years later, the one that referenced the territorial water priority, statute, and the phrase prior appropriation, which in Wyoming law meant that the first person to register a water claim held the senior right to that water, above all subsequent claimants in perpetuity. Mrs. Alderton had watched them with the professional calm of a woman who had seen many things come through her office. She asked what they were looking for. Making sure something stays found, Samuel had said. Mrs. Alderton had written a note in her logbook, dated it, and returned the bundle to its drawer. Clara had watched her hands as she worked the sure and careful movements of a woman who took her job seriously and had thought about what it meant that her grandfather had chosen this particular woman in this particular office as the keeper of something he was not ready to spend. On the ride home, Samuel had told her the rest. Black Hollow sits over a basin, he said. Underground. Spring-fed. The rock holds it down, keeps it clean. 30 feet below the surface, maybe less in places. Enough water to supply a town twice the size of what Redstone is now. Clean water. Steady flow. The kind of source that a growing community needs when the seasonal creeks run low in summer. Why haven't you drilled it? She asked. Because nobody needs it yet, he said. And when they do, it will be worth considerably more than it is today. He had looked at her then with the expression she could never quite name. Not love, though there was love in it. Something sharper. A recognition. The particular look a man gives you when he has decided that you are the person he is going to trust with something important. There is also the pass, he said. 22 feet at the narrowest point. Less than 3% grade. The only viable corridor through the ridge for 6 miles in either direction. The adjacent parcels are fractured basalt and loose shale. Too steep, too unstable, too expensive to grade. Any engineer working within a reasonable budget who wants to push a rail line west through this territory will look at that pass and understand what it means. She had understood then, not all of it, not the legal dimensions that Margaret Voss would later explain to her in a law office in Cheyenne, but the shape of it, the logic of it, the patient long game architecture of a man who had been thinking about this for 30 years and had finally found the right person to leave it to. Don't tell anyone what I've shown you, he said. Not yet. Let them think it's just rock. She had wanted to ask why. Why the secrecy? Why not file the claims openly, tell the family what the land was worth, let everyone benefit? But there was something in his face that stopped her questions. Not evasion, not concealment, something steadier than both. He was not hiding from his family. He was protecting something for, sure, specifically, deliberately, with full understanding of what he was doing and why. Later, she understood the rest of it. The men who ran the Holt Ranch were competent men. They understood cattle and grass and seasonal water cycles and the politics of who you hired and who you trusted. They saw land the way most men saw land, as surface, as what you could use today. Samuel had tried to teach them otherwise. He had shown Garfield the geological surveys. He had explained to Douglas how mineral rights worked, how water tables shifted with the seasons, how the westward push of the railroad would eventually change the value of every parcel between Redstone and the mountains. They had listened, they had nodded, and then they had gone back to counting cattle. Samuel had stopped trying not out of bitterness, because the old man had no bitterness in him, but out of a clear recognition that some knowledge requires a particular kind of mind to receive it. A mind that could hold a thing without needing to act on it immediately. A mind that understood waiting as discipline rather than inaction. Clara had that mind. He had known it before she did. The last time they had ridden together, the autumn of 1883, 6 months before he died, he had given her the key to the cedar chest. Everything I know is in there, he said. When the time comes, you'll know what to do with it. She had asked when the time would come. He had looked out across the hollow where the light was turning gold on the ridge the way it did in October when the angle was right. When someone wants what's underneath, he said. And they will, sooner than most people think. He had been right. He was always right about the land. The week after the will reading, Clara rode out to the northern tract on a Tuesday morning, early before the town was properly awake. Ridge picked her way through the broken ground of the hollow with the careful attention of a horse that respected difficult terrain. Ash trotted ahead, nose down, moving through the cedar scrub and the pale limestone slabs with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had done this before and found nothing here worth worrying about. The 40 acres looked exactly as everyone believed it did. Rough ground, dry, uninviting, scrub cedar and loose shale, and patches of bunch grass that gave up trying by midsummer. The kind of landscape that seemed to apologize for existing. Nothing about it announced itself. Nothing said, pay attention here. That was, of course, precisely the point. Clara dismounted at the north end of the hollow, where the ridge dropped away into a shallow draw, and walked to the spot her grandfather had marked in his notebook with a small X and the word listen. She knelt down and pressed both palms flat against the stone. Cool. Distinctly unmistakably cool, in a way that bare limestone should not have been at mid-morning in April, when the sun had been on it for 3 hours. The cool of water in motion beneath solid rock. Steady. Deep. Patient in the way that only underground things are patient, because underground things have been waiting since before anyone had a word for waiting. She pressed her palms harder and closed her eyes. She could not hear it. Not exactly, but she could feel it. A presence in the stone, a steadiness that was not the steadiness of inert matter, but of something alive and moving and continuous. The land was holding something keeping it safe, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She opened her eyes and looked at Ash. The dog had settled beside her. His chin on the limestone, his amber eyes half closed in the morning light. He did not appear particularly impressed. He had been here before. You and Grandpa? Clara said quietly. Always ahead of me. She sat back on her heels and looked out across the hollow. The wind came through the gap in the ridge, steady and clean, carrying cedar and dry stone and the faint mineral smell of the limestone itself. Above the pass, a red-tailed hawk was working the thermal that rose from the hollow south face, riding it in long, slow circles without moving its wings. Everything out here understood the land better than the men who claimed to own it. Clara reached into her coat and took out the notebook she had brought from the cedar chest. She turned to the page where Samuel had mapped the limestone shelf, his measurements and cross-sections drawn in the precise, unhurried hand of a man who had taken his time. She followed the lines with her finger. The shelf extended northwest for nearly a mile beneath the surface, dense, high-quality limestone sitting between 40 and 60 feet down, the kind the railroad companies used for ballast and foundation work, the kind that was becoming scarce in the territories as the lines pushed west and the easy quarries near the established towns played out. In the margin in pencil, Samuel had written, conservative estimates only. Actual deposit likely 3 to 4 times this figure. Underlined twice. Directly above the shelf, running along the surface, through the natural corridor of the pass, was the route. 22 feet at its narrowest. Grade less than 3%. Solid footing throughout. The adjacent parcels on both sides were fractured basalt and loose shale, too steep and too unstable for any engineer with a budget and a deadline. Clara had read the railroad's published route surveys at the county office. Anyone could read them. Nobody in the Holt family apparently had. The Western Frontier Rail Company's proposed extension west from Redstone had stalled for 2 years because they could not secure right-of-way through the hollow. They had tried the adjacent parcels and found the terrain impossible. They had looked at tunneling and found the cost prohibitive. They had considered a southern bypass that would add 40 miles and a mountain crossing that no investor would fund. The only viable route was through the pass, and the pass belonged to Clara. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the worn leather cover, thinking about all the hands that had held it before hers. Samuel on a limestone ridge in 1868. 20 years before, Claire was old enough to understand anything. Samuel in the land office in 1872, watching his claim get stamped and filed and set aside in a drawer where it would wait patient as the water beneath the rock for the right moment. He had not done this by accident. He had not done it on impulse or sentiment. He had done it with the same precision he brought to every geological survey, the same cold eyed assessment of future value that had built the Holt Ranch in the first place. He had looked at this ground and seen not what it was in 1870, but what it would be in 1890. And he had positioned Clara accordingly decades in advance with a patience that most people would not recognize as love because it looked too much like strategy. But it was both. That was what nobody understood about Samuel Holt. The love and the strategy were the same thing. He had not left her the good land because he knew what would happen to good land. Good land gets divided and sold and argued over and reduced by the competing claims of men who understand its present value. He had left her the rock and the pass and the water beneath the stone because he knew that only one person in the Holt family had the particular combination of patience, intelligence, and stubbornness to understand what it was actually worth. And he had been teaching her for 23 years. She put the notebook back in her coat and stood up. Ridge was grazing on the thin grass at the edge of the ridge, patient as always, the reins loose over a cedar branch. Ash was still lying on the limestone, eyes closed now, his breathing slow and even in the morning air. Clara looked out across the 40 acres that everyone in that courthouse had dismissed in under 3 seconds. She looked at the pass cutting through the ridge above her 22 feet of solid ground and manageable grade that the railroad had been trying to reach for 2 years without knowing it was already spoken for. Then she thought about Douglas's laugh, the loose, certain sound of a man confirming what he already believed. The particular note in it that said she was exactly what he had always taken her for. Nothing personal. Nothing worth considering. She thought about that for a while. The hawk above the pass had stopped circling and gone somewhere else. The wind moved through the cedars at the edge of the hollow with a sound like breathing. Clara Holt picked up Ridge's reins, swung up into the saddle, and turned toward home. She had work to do. And she had learned from the best man she ever knew that the most powerful thing in the world was knowing something important and having the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to use it. The surveyors arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, 3 weeks after the will reading, when the cottonwoods along the creek had just begun to show their first pale green, and the morning still carried enough cold to make a man's breath visible. There were 3 of them, plus the engineer. They came up the north road in a wagon loaded with transit levels and chain measures and wooden stakes, moving at the deliberate pace of men who had been sent to do a job and had no particular reason to hurry. The engineer rode ahead of the wagon on a good gray horse. He wore a clean hat and a jacket that had not seen much field work. He had the careful manners of a man who needed something and had been trained to ask for it politely. His name was Everett Crane. He was the chief surveying engineer for the Western Frontier Rail Company's Wyoming expansion, and he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to find a way through Black Ridge Hollow without succeeding. He had surveyed the adjacent parcels. He had priced the tunneling. He had drawn the southern bypass on a map and shown it to investors in Denver and watched their faces go flat when they saw the mileage. He had been thorough and professional and completely unsuccessful. And now he was riding up the north road toward 40 acres that until 3 weeks ago he had not known existed as a separate parcel. Clara was already there. She had ridden out at dawn before the mist had fully cleared from the hollow, and she was sitting on the flat limestone boulder at the edge of the pass. The same boulder where Samuel had sat on a dozen autumn mornings. The same place where she had pressed her palms to the rock 2 weeks before and felt the cold truth of the water moving 30 feet below. She had a leather notebook open on her knee, and she was writing in it, and she did not look up when she heard the wagon coming up the road. Ash lay beside her with his chin on the stone, facing the road, watching. Crane pulled his horse up at the property line and sat for a moment, taking in the scene. A young woman sitting alone on a boulder in the middle of what his maps described as uninhabited rockland, writing in a notebook with a gray coyote dog at her feet, looking at him as though she had been expecting him for some time. He dismounted, took off his hat. Miss Holt. Mr. Crane? She did not look up immediately from her notebook. She finished the line she was writing, closed the book, and looked at him. I know who you are. I know what you're looking for. Crane paused. He had prepared a speech about the railroad's plans, the benefit to the Redstone community, the generous compensation the company offered for easement rights. He had given versions of the speech to 37 landowners in the past 2 years, and it had worked well enough on most of them. He had not prepared for this. Then you know why I'm here, he said. I know you've been trying to get through this pass for 2 years. She looked past him at the wagon, at the 3 surveyors sitting on the bench, watching the exchange. I know you've approached every parcel along this corridor and found nothing workable. I know you priced the southern bypass in January, and your investors said no. She paused. I know you came up here with a contract already drawn. Crane was quiet for a moment. May I ask how you know that? My grandfather surveyed this land for 30 years. He taught me to read what he found. She stood up from the boulder, smoothed her coat, and looked at him directly. He also taught me to read the railroad's published route surveys, which are available at the county office to anyone who cares to look. She reached out her hand, not to shake his, but palm up, waiting. Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced the document. Clara took it. She read it in the careful, unhurried way. She read everything important, working through each clause, her expression giving nothing away. Crane stood with his hat in his hands and waited. When she finished, she turned to the signature line. She read the name written there. Then she looked up at Crane with an expression that was not quite a question, but required an answer. That's Garfield Holt's name, she said. Crane's face did not change, but something behind it did. That was the name we were given to expect. By whom? A pause that lasted just long enough to tell her everything she needed to know. By Douglas Holt, Crane said. 2 weeks before the will was read, Clara looked down at the contract again. She read the date on it. She did the calculation. Douglas had signed a preliminary agreement with the Western Frontier Rail Company 14 days before Walter Reed had stood in Judge Calloway's courtroom and read out the final clause of Samuel Holt's will. 14 days before anyone in that room had heard the words 40 acres beyond Black Ridge Hollow and the name Clara Holt in the same sentence. Douglas had been certain. He had been so certain about what the will would say, so certain about what mattered and what didn't, so certain that his quiet, landless cousin, who lived at the edge of town and took in mending, had no claim on anything that could affect his plans, that he had already spent the money. $200 advance payment in exchange for a promise he had not had the legal right to make. Clara folded the contract along its original crease. She held it out to Crane. Wrong name, she said. Crane took it back slowly. He looked at her, and she could see him reassessing, recalculating the way a careful engineer does when the ground turns out to be different from the survey. Miss Holt, he said, the company is prepared to offer fair compensation for easement rights through the corridor. We believe the terms. I'll need time to review any terms, Clara said. Come back in 3 weeks with a proper proposal, in writing, with your company's full name and the names of the principals at the top of the page. She picked up her notebook. And Mr. Crane, when you come back, come alone. Leave the wagon. She walked to where Ridge was tied at the cedar at the edge of the draw, swung up into the saddle, and rode back toward town without looking behind her. Ash followed at his usual trot, neither fast nor slow, entirely unbothered. Crane stood at the property line and watched her go. Then he put his hat back on, turned to the three surveyors on the wagon, and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Douglas came to Claire's house 2 days later. She was in the garden when she heard the horse, the deliberate sound of a man who wanted to be heard coming, who wanted to give her time to be ready. Douglas understood presentation. He understood the value of arriving at the right moment. He had been calculating the right moment since he heard from Crane what had happened at the property line. He dismounted and tied his horse at the fence post and came around to the garden gate. He was dressed well better than necessary for a visit to his cousin's house, which told Clara that he had thought carefully about this and decided that looking prosperous was the right approach. He held his hat in both hands when he came through the gate, which was the body language of a man who wanted something but was managing it. "Clara," he said. "Douglas." She kept working the row she was working, loosening the soil around the bean seedlings with a short-handled hoe. "I'll be done in a few minutes." He waited. That was not what he wanted to do, she could tell, but he did it because he was smart enough to know that pushing her right now was wrong. He stood in the garden gate and watched her work and held his hat and kept his face arranged in an expression of patient reasonableness. When she finished the row, she straightened up and looked at him. He said what she had expected him to say. He talked about family. He talked about the Holt name and what it meant in Redstone. He talked about practical matters, the railroad's interest, the opportunity, the fact that 40 acres of rock and scrub cedar was not, in any realistic accounting, worth what he seemed to think she thought it was worth. He was polite about all of it. That was his gift, Douglas. He could say things that cut without raising his voice. Then he said, "You're holding this family hostage over 40 acres of rock." Clara set down the hoe. She looked at him for a long moment. The silence in the garden was the specific silence of late morning. The birds gone quiet in the heat. The wind temporarily still, just the sound of a horse shifting at the fence. "You laugh, Douglas," she said. "In the courthouse, when they read my name." He started to speak. "I heard you," she said. He closed his mouth. "It wasn't cruel. I understand that. You weren't trying to hurt me. That's the thing. You laughed because, to you, in that moment, I was exactly what you'd always taken me for. My father's daughter, the poor relation, the woman with the mending business." She kept her eyes on him steady and unhurried. "It wasn't personal." "Clara." "That's exactly the problem, Douglas. To you, I was nothing personal." He stood there with his hat in his hands and the late morning light coming through the garden gate behind him. He was not a man who lost arguments, and this was not quite an argument, which made it harder. There was nothing to push against. She was not angry. She was not accusing him of anything he could deny. She was simply telling him what had happened and what it meant with the same precise calm that Samuel Holt had once used to explain geological formations to anyone patient enough to listen. "What do you want?" he said finally. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I want to conduct my business fairly and legally, which is what I intend to do. If that benefits the family, I'll be glad of it. But I'm not conducting my business for the benefit of the family." She picked up the hoe again. "You're welcome to stay for coffee, Douglas. If you'd like to talk about something else." He did not stay for coffee. He put on his hat and walked back through the garden gate and untied his horse and rode back toward town. Claire watched him go, then turned back to her beans. Ash watched from the porch, his amber eyes tracking Douglas until he was out of sight. In the weeks that followed, the pressure came from every direction and in every possible form. Crane came back as she had asked a loan with a formal proposal that was better than the first, but still structured as a purchase. The company wanted to own the corridor outright. The figure they offered was $1,000, which was a sum that would have seemed substantial to most people in Redstone, and was to anyone who understood what the pass was actually worth to a railroad that had no other option. An insult delivered politely. Clara read the proposal in full. She thanked Crane for coming. She told him she would be in touch. Then came the men from Denver. There were two of them, a partnership that had been following the railroad's western expansion, the way certain birds follow cattle, looking for the disruptions that create opportunity. They arrived at Claire's door on a Wednesday evening in early June, 2 weeks after Crane's visit, well dressed and well prepared, carrying documents and a manner of relaxed confidence that suggested they were accustomed to getting what they came for. They had done their homework. That was clear within the first 5 minutes. They had pulled the land office records. They had found Samuel's 1872 mineral and water rights registration. They understood perhaps better than Douglas or Garfield or anyone else in Redstone exactly what they were looking at. They offered $5,000. Clara made coffee and set it on the table and listened to everything they said. She asked 2 or 3 questions, the kind of questions that made the men exchange glances because the questions were precise and informed and not what they had expected from a 23-year-old woman in a house at the edge of a small Wyoming town. She read every page of the document they had brought. Then she thanked them for making the trip from Denver and told them she would think about it. They left their card. They said they hoped to hear from her soon. They were confident in the way men are confident when they believe the outcome is inevitable, and patience is simply the remaining formality. That night, Clara sat alone at her kitchen table for a long time. $5,000 was a number that had a physical weight to it. She could feel it in the room pressing against the walls. $5,000 was 10 years of mending work. It was the debt her father had died owing twice over. It was the kind of number that could buy land, buy security, buy the kind of permanent practical stability that she had been living without since she was 17 years old. She pulled Samuel's notebook from the cedar chest and opened it to the page she had been reading on the boulder at the pass. She read for a while, following his notations about the limestone shelf, about the water table, about the grade and the footing of the corridor. She turned pages slowly, reading his margin notes, the observations he had made over 3 summers of careful work. Then she turned to the page near the middle of the book, where he had written years ago in the same precise hand. The man who names a price for something is the man who doesn't understand its value. She sat with that for a long time. Then she opened her own notebook to a blank page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote $5,000. And below it, she wrote a question that she did not put to paper easily, because she was not a woman who put her uncertainties on paper easily. Grandpa, is it enough? Am I doing this right? She looked at what she had written. Outside, the wind was moving through Redstone, the way it always did at night, finding every gap and loose board. Ash was breathing slowly by the stove. She turned back to Samuel's notebook. She read the margin note again. She thought about the hawk she had watched above the pass on the morning she had pressed her palms to the stone. She thought about Samuel on his horse in the October light, looking out at the ridge, certain and unhurried, and already 10 years ahead of everyone around him. She turned back to her own notebook. She drew a single line through the question she had written. Then she closed both books and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she made the decision before morning, in that particular dark hour when things become clear, not through reasoning, but through exhaustion of the alternatives. She had asked the question. She had felt the uncertainty, which was real and deserved to be felt. And then she had come out the other side of it. She was not selling, not the land, not the water, not the pass, not to Crane, not to the Denver men, not to anyone. She needed a lawyer. The next morning, she wrote a letter to Cheyenne. Harriet Voss was not what Redstone expected when it thought about lawyers. She was 42 years old, a compact and direct woman with gray streaked hair and eyes that moved over a document the way Clara's moved over a geological survey, noticing everything, wasting nothing. She had practiced law in Wyoming Territory for 14 years, specializing in mining contracts and railroad easements. She had handled claims that three other lawyers had said were unwinnable and had won two of them. The third she had settled on terms so favorable to her client that the opposing party had requested a meeting afterward to understand what had happened. She arrived in Redstone on a Monday, 2 weeks after Clara's letter, with a leather briefcase and no particular interest in what anyone in town thought about a woman practicing law. They met at Clara's house. Clara put the cedar chest on the table between them and opened it and let Harriet work through the notebooks and the documents in the order she wanted to work through them, which was not chronological but structural, starting with the land office filings and moving backward through the geological evidence. Harriet read in silence for a long time. Occasionally, she made a note. Once she looked up at Clara with an expression that was not quite surprise, but close to it, and then looked back down at the document in her hands. After 2 hours, she set down the last page and looked across the table. Your grandfather filed this water claim under the prior appropriation clause of the 1871 Wyoming Territory Water Act, she said. I know, Claire said. Do you know what prior appropriation means in practice under territorial law? It means the first registered claimant has senior rights to that water source above all subsequent claimants. Harriet looked at her. Senior rights in perpetuity, subject to beneficial use requirements, but those are easily met given the municipal water provisions in the same statute. She tapped the document. Your grandfather didn't just register a water claim for 40 acres. He registered the senior water right to this basin under a statute that explicitly covers municipal supply. If Redstone wants to tap this source when it grows, and it will grow when that railroad comes through, they will need your permission. Not a purchase, not a one-time payment, a licensing agreement, ongoing, renewable, indexed to need. Clara had understood the outline of this. She had not known the exact legal language. She let Harriet explain it fully, and then she asked 3 questions, and Harriet answered all 3 with the precision of a woman who did not use approximations when precision was available. Then Clara said, What about the pass, the easement? The pass is the simpler piece, Harriet said. You own it. The railroad needs it. They have no alternative route that pencils out. The question is structure. She set her pen on the table. They want to buy it outright. You should not sell it. I know. A long-term lease with terms tied to freight volume gives you a revenue stream that grows as the rail traffic grows. A purchase gives you a one-time payment and removes you from all future upside. Harriet looked at the documents. Based on the projected traffic volumes in the railroad's own published filings, a properly structured lease would likely generate more income in the first 5 years than the purchase price they're offering. In 20 years, it would not be comparable. Clara nodded. She had run this calculation herself, roughly using the railroad's published numbers. It was good to have it confirmed by someone who read contracts for a living. There is one more thing, Harriet said. She pulled out a document from her briefcase, a separate filing, and set it on the table. It was a complaint stamped by the Redstone County Courthouse, dated 4 days earlier. Clara picked it up and read it. Douglas had filed suit contesting the validity of Samuel's 1872 mineral and water rights registration on the grounds that Samuel Holt had acted without the knowledge or consent of the Holt family partnership at the time of the filing, and that Samuel's mental capacity to make binding legal decisions had been compromised by age and what the filing described as prolonged solitary behavior inconsistent with sound judgment. Clara read the complaint twice. Then she set it down on the table. He's saying Grandpa was not of sound mind, she said. That's the argument, Harriet said. It's a weak one. The 1872 filing predates any partnership agreement by 3 years, so the partnership consent argument fails immediately. The mental capacity claim requires evidence, and what evidence exists points in exactly the opposite direction. She paused. But weak arguments can cause delays. A contested filing can hold up a contract for 6 weeks, 2 months, long enough to make the railroad nervous, long enough to put financial pressure on a claimant who doesn't have resources for a prolonged legal dispute. He knows I don't have resources for a prolonged legal dispute, Clara said. Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Ash moved by the stove. Outside, a wagon passed on the street, the driver calling something to someone across the road, the ordinary sound of a Tuesday in a small town. What do we need to defeat it? Clara said. Evidence of Samuel's competence and clarity of mind in 1872 and in the years following. His own records will help significantly. Those notebooks are detailed dated, technically sophisticated work. A layman could look at them and understand that the man who made them was not operating in diminished capacity. Harriet paused. Ideally, a witness. Someone who interacted with him professionally at or near the time of the 1872 filing. Someone whose credibility the court would accept without question. Clara thought for a moment. Then she thought of Mrs. Alderton, the woman at the land office counter in 1879. The composed, precise woman who had retrieved Samuel's bundle from the back room and watched him show Clara the documents and written a note in her logbook with the careful hands of a professional who took her work seriously. The woman at the land office, Clara said. She was there in 1879. She saw him. She wrote it in her logbook. If she's still in Redstone. She retired 3 years ago. She lives on Birch Street. Clara stood up. She's 50 years old, and she has a memory like a land record. Nothing goes in that she doesn't keep. Harriet Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. Then we have what we need, she said. They went to see Mrs. Alderton that afternoon. The retired clerk lived in a neat house with a kitchen garden and a bookshelf that covered an entire wall of her front room. She received them with the untroubled dignity of a woman who was accustomed to being consulted by people who eventually realized they should have come sooner. Clara explained what had been filed. Mrs. Alderton listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, she stood up, went to the bookshelf, and took down a narrow volume with a faded cover. I kept my own logbooks, she said. 22 years of them. She opened it to a marked page and set it on the table. The entry was dated spring 1879, 14 years ago. The handwriting was the same steady, precise script Clara remembered from watching her work. S. Holt and granddaughter C. Holt. Review of Mineral and Water Rights Filings, Northern Tract, Black Ridge. Mr. Holt, in full command, explained filings in detail to granddaughter. No concerns. Notation complete. Mrs. Alderton looked up. He was the clearest-minded man I ever saw walk through that door, she said. If anyone in that courthouse thinks otherwise, I will be happy to tell them so directly. Harriet Voss wrote something in her own notebook and said nothing, which was the professional equivalent of a smile. The hearing on Douglas's complaint took place 12 days later. It lasted 45 minutes. Harriet presented the notebook 17 years of precise, dated, technically sophisticated, geological work. She presented the testimony of Mrs. Alderton, who sat in the witness chair with her logbook open on her knee and answered every question in the same unhurried factual tone she had used for 22 years behind a government counter. She presented the 1871 partnership agreement that predated the 1872 filing by 3 years, which made the consent argument not merely weak, but legally incoherent. Judge Calloway dismissed the complaint on all 3 grounds. The hearing was over before noon. Clara walked out of the courthouse into the June sunlight. The same door she had walked out of 6 weeks earlier, with a folded piece of paper in her pocket, and the sound of Douglas's laugh still in her ears. Harriet came out behind her and stood beside her on the steps. "We can begin drafting the lease terms this afternoon," Harriet said. "Yes," Clara said. She stood on the steps for a moment in the warm June air. Ash was tied at the rail below, watching her with his amber eyes. Ridge was at the hitching post, patient already pointed toward home. Clara thought about Douglas sitting alone in his office reading the dismissal notice. She thought about the $200 advance payment he had already spent. She thought about the particular quality of his laugh in the courthouse. That Tuesday in April, the loose and certain sound of a man confirming what he already believed. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. It was not that kind of feeling. It was something quieter. The feeling of a thing unfolding the way it was always going to unfold, because the groundwork had been laid with sufficient care 30 years ago, by a man who understood that the land went down as well as up, and that what was underneath was always the real story. She walked down the courthouse steps and untied Ash's lead and stood beside Ridge in the June heat. There was still work to do. The most important work was still ahead of her. But the foundation was solid. Samuel had made it solid all those years ago, kneeling on a limestone ridge above an empty hollow, writing in his careful hand, building something that looked like nothing at all to everyone who passed it by. Clara put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. She had learned that lesson young. She had learned it in the way that the best lessons get learned not from a single conversation, but from 100 mornings on horseback, following an old man across the rocky ground of the northern hills, watching him tap stone and make notes, and look at the land with the patient, informed attention of someone who was not asking what it was worth today. He was always asking what it would be worth when the right time came. The right time was coming. Claire could feel it the way she had felt the water beneath the stone that April morning, not as a sound, but as a presence. Something moving beneath the surface, steady and deep and patient, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She turned Ridge toward home and let the horse find her own pace through the June afternoon, the town of Redstone falling away behind her, the ridge rising ahead through the shimmer of the summer heat, the pass cutting clean through the limestone exactly as Samuel had measured it, exactly as wide and exactly that grade waiting. The contract was signed on a Thursday morning in late June in the Redstone County Clerk's office, with Walter Reed serving as notary and Harriet Voss sitting across the table from the Western Frontier Rail Company's 2 senior representatives who had come down from Cheyenne specifically for the occasion, and had the careful expressions of men who had negotiated hard and lost and were trying to look like they had not. Everett Crane was there. He sat to the left of the company representatives, his clean hat on his knee, his survey maps folded in his jacket pocket. He had been in the room for every negotiation session over the previous 3 weeks, and he had watched Claire work through every counterproposal with the same unhurried attention she brought to a geological formation she was trying to understand. By the end of the 2nd week, he had stopped underestimating her. By the end of the 3rd, he had developed the particular professional respect that one careful person sometimes develops for another, regardless of what they expected at the beginning. The terms were Clara's. Not because she had been aggressive, not because she had threatened or maneuvered in the ways that men in negotiating rooms understood as tactics. She had simply known more than they did about what she owned, and she had refused to pretend otherwise, and in the end, that was sufficient. The Western Frontier Rail Company received a 20-year renewable easement through the corridor, with a right of first negotiation on renewal. In exchange, Claire received annual payments indexed to freight volume through the spur with a minimum floor regardless of traffic. The limestone from the shelf below her 40 acres would be quarried under a separate extraction agreement with a per ton revenue share paid to Clara for the duration of the rail line's operation. The water rights remained entirely hers, not leased, not licensed to the railroad. Hers. Clara signed her name at the bottom of the document in the same even unhurried hand that Samuel had used in his notebooks. She did not look up when she signed. She did not look at Crane or at the company representatives or at Harriet, who sat beside her with her own copy of the contract, already marked and annotated. She thought about Samuel. She thought about him kneeling on the limestone ridge in the cold October light, with his instruments beside him, tapping the rock, making his notes already 10 years ahead of everyone around him. She thought about the way he had looked at her on their last ride together, the autumn before he died, with that expression she had never quite been able to name. She understood it now. It had taken her until this moment to understand it fully. It was not love. It was not pride. It was the particular look of a man who had worked for a very long time on something important and had finally placed it in the right hands and could feel with the deep satisfaction of a craftsman that the work was not going to be wasted. She capped her pen and set it on the table. Reed blotted the signatures. The company representatives gathered their copies. Crane stood and put on his hat and extended his hand to Clara across the table. "Your grandfather built something remarkable out here," he said. "I don't think any of us understood that until now." Clara shook his hand. "He understood it," she said. "That was enough for him." Crane nodded once slowly and walked out of the clerk's office into the June morning. Clara watched him go and then looked down at her copy of the contract on the table in front of her, the pages aligned, the signatures dry, the thing done. Harriet put a hand briefly on her forearm. "Congratulations, Miss Holt." "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything." "Thank your grandfather," Harriet said. "I just read what he wrote." The news moved through Redstone the way all significant news moves through a small town, which is to say, immediately unevenly, and with a great deal of interpretation attached to it by the time it reached any given set of ears. By afternoon, the feed store had its version. By evening, the saloon had 3. By the following Sunday, the pastor had incorporated something about providence and careful stewardship into his sermon, which made Clara uncomfortable, but which she sat through without comment. Because correcting a pastor's sermon about you in his own church required a social courage she did not feel the occasion warranted. The shape of the truth was clear enough without her help. Clara Holt, the quiet woman at the edge of town with the coyote dog, had negotiated a contract with the Western Frontier Rail Company on terms that nobody in Redstone had believed possible 3 months ago. She had not sold an acre. She had not borrowed $1. She had walked into a room with a railroad company and a leather notebook and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent 30 years reading the land, and she had come out with an agreement that would generate more annual income than the Holt South pasture produced in beef. Douglas read his copy of the contract in his office above the warehouse. His clerk had obtained a copy from the county records office, which was his right as a Holt family member with interests in adjacent parcels. He read it once in full without stopping. Then he set it on his desk and sat very still for a long time. The minimum annual payment alone, the floor payment regardless of freight volume, was more than twice what he had received as advance deposit for the preliminary agreement he had signed in April. The preliminary agreement that was now void, the one where he had been certain, absolutely certain, that the land would fall to someone other than Clara. He sat in his office until the light through the window changed from afternoon to evening, and he did not send for anyone, and he did not go downstairs to the warehouse floor where his clerks were finishing the day's inventory, and he did not ride out to see Garfield or any of the other men he usually consulted when something needed deciding. He just sat there alone with what he had done and what it had cost, and with the particular silence of a certain kind of man when he finally encounters a mistake he cannot account book his way out of. Nobody ever reported what Douglas Holt said in that office on the evening of June the 26th, 1884. Nobody was there to hear it. But in the years that followed, people who dealt with him noticed a change that was hard to name precisely. Something in the set of his certainty had shifted. Not broken. Douglas Holt did not break easily, but shifted the way limestone shifts under enough pressure, settling into a new configuration that was more honest about what it could and could not hold. The first person to say anything direct to Clara was Calhoun. Pete Calhoun had been the Holt Ranch foreman for 19 years, a weathered man of 55 who wore Samuel's old saddle and carried in his face the record of every Wyoming winter he had worked through. He found Clara at the feed store on a Friday morning in July, 3 weeks after the signing. He came in while she was settling an account with the proprietor, and he waited until she was done turning his hat in his hands the way men do when they have something to say and are not entirely sure of the saying of it. Clara had known Calhoun since she was 9 years old. She knew his silences. When the proprietor stepped into the back room, Calhoun cleared his throat. "Your grandfather was the smartest man I ever worked for," he said. His voice had the particular roughness of a man who does not make speeches. "I've been thinking about saying that to you for a while now. I wanted you to know I never laughed. Not in that courtroom, not in my head." He paused. "I should have paid more attention. That's the truth of it." Clara looked at him. There was no calculation in what he had said, no self-interest, just an old cowhand in a feed store turning his hat in his hands and telling her the truth. "Grandpa thought the world of you, Pete," she said. "I know it." He put his hat back on. "I think maybe you're smarter than him, is the other thing I wanted to say." Clara shook her head. "I'm not sure. I just view she I just listened." Calhoun nodded once, satisfied, as if she had confirmed something he already believed, and walked back out into the July morning. That was the entirety of it. 30 seconds in a feed store. No witnesses, no ceremony. Clara stood for a moment after he left, looking at the door he had walked through, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled. Garfield came in August. He did not come with a prepared speech. He came on a Tuesday evening when the heat had finally broken and the air coming off the mountains had the first suggestion of autumn in it, and he tied his horse at Claire's fence and knocked on her door. And when she opened it, he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had been thinking about this for 2 months and still had not worked out exactly how to do it. She let him in and made coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from him and waited. He drank half his coffee before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Garfield." I laughed. He looked down at the table. Not out loud, but in my head when Reed read that clause, I laughed. I thought the old man was being sentimental, giving you rocks because he loved you. He shook his head. "I should have known better. I worked for him for 20 years. He tried to tell you," Clara said. "He tried to tell both of you. About the geology, about the water table, about how the railroad was going to change everything north of town. He showed you the surveys. Garfield was quiet for a moment. I listened. I just didn't hear it. There's a difference, Clara said. There is. He looked up at her. He knew you'd hear it. He wasn't certain. He hoped. She refilled his coffee. He was practical about it, too. He understood that some things require a particular kind of patience to receive, and that not everyone has that patience. It wasn't a judgment. It was just how he saw people. Garfield nodded slowly. He turned the coffee cup in his hands around and around. Ash watched from beside the stove with his amber eyes, the way he watched everything with calm and total attention. He was being sentimental, Clara said finally. He loved me, but he was also being practical. That's the thing people don't understand about Grandpa. The love and the practicality were the same thing. They weren't separate. Garfield sat with that for a moment. Then he drank the rest of his coffee and stood up and put on his hat. I'm glad it was you, he said. For what it's worth, I'm glad he left it to you. It's worth something, Clara said. She walked him to the door and watched him ride away. In the August evening, the first stars just beginning to show above the ridge. When she turned back inside, Ash was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her. He meant it, she told the dog. Ash went back to the stove. He had not doubted it. Sheriff Briggs stopped her on Main Street one afternoon in early September, stepping out of the doorway of the land office as she was passing, timing it so precisely that she wondered if he had been watching for her. Miss Holt, he said. Sheriff? He fell into step beside her, which was Briggs's way of having a conversation that he wanted to be able to end without ceremony. He looked straight ahead as he walked. I was at the reading, he said. Back wall. I know. I didn't laugh. Clara looked at him for a moment as they walked. No, you didn't. I didn't pay attention either. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, without inflection or excuse. I knew the land. I knew the North Tract was rough ground. I heard the claws, and I moved on to the next thing. A pause. I should have been smarter about it. You didn't laugh, Claire said. That's not nothing. It's almost the same thing. It's not the same thing, she said. But I appreciate you saying so. They walked another half block in silence. Then Briggs stopped and turned to face her. He was a man who, when he had something to say, said it and was done. You handled it well, he said. The whole of it, the filing, the suit, the railroad. You handled it the way your grandfather would have. Maybe better. He touched the brim of his hat. Good morning, Miss Holt. Good morning, Sheriff. He walked back toward the land office without looking back. Clara stood on the Main Street boardwalk for a moment and watched him go and thought that there were different kinds of apologies in the world, and Briggs's kind, direct, and unadorned, and containing no self-pity, was the kind she respected most. Douglas's apology came differently in the way that things come from men who do not apologize directly, because direct apology requires a vulnerability they have not learned to afford. One morning in October, Clara found a plain envelope on her kitchen table, left through the door she had forgotten to latch the night before. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letter. No explanation. Just the record of a debt. Her father's debt, the gambling debt that had been the Holt family's private shame for 5 years. The thing that had been held over her head as subtly and constantly as weather. The paper had been stamped paid in full in the hand of the creditor, a man in Cheyenne whom Clara had never met. And the paper had been burned, and then the ash of it had been gathered and placed in the envelope, and on the outside of the envelope in Douglas's handwriting was her name. Nothing else. Clara sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the envelope in her hands. She knew immediately who had done it. She knew the way you know certain things not by evidence, but by understanding the person. Douglas Holt did not put his name on apologies. He put his money on them. He paid the debt and burned the record and delivered the ashes. And that was his way of saying what he could not bring himself to say in a room with another person watching his face. It was not the apology she might have chosen, but she understood it and she received it for what it was. She put the envelope in the cedar chest. In November, at a family gathering at Garfield's house, that was ostensibly about planning the spring cattle rotation, Douglas arrived late and sat across the table from Clara and participated in the business discussion with his usual precise competence. At the end of the meeting, when the maps had been folded and the coffee was cold, someone raised a question about water access for the south pasture in drought years. Douglas was quiet for a moment, then he looked across the table at Clara. Clara, he said, what do you think? The room was briefly still. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no witnesses paying particular attention. But Clara understood the weight of it, the specific gravity of Douglas Holt asking his cousin what she thought about something that mattered in a room full of family with the same deliberate directness he brought to every other serious question in his life. I think the South Creek access needs to be secured before the railroad construction disrupts the drainage pattern, she said. I can show you where the geology suggests the flow will shift. That would be helpful, Douglas said. That was the entirety of it. 2 sentences. No one else in the room understood what had just passed between them. Clara understood it completely. It was the apology Douglas Holt was capable of making, which was not the kind that looked backward, but the kind that looked forward. The kind that said, I was wrong about what you were, and I am adjusting accordingly. It was enough. The rail crews arrived in spring of 1885, moving up from Redstone with their grading equipment and their supply wagons and the particular organized noise of industrial construction, pushing into country that had previously known only wind and cattle and the occasional survey team. Clara rode out to watch them work on the first morning, sitting ridge on the high ground above the pass, where she could see the full line of the operation. They were good workers. Crane ran a tight crew, efficient and careful, and he had clearly done his preparation because the grading followed the corridor exactly as Samuel's maps had drawn it, taking the pass at its widest points and managing the grade with the precision of engineers who understood what the ground was telling them. The limestone came out of the shelf below at a rate that confirmed Samuel's conservative estimates within the first month. The quality was exactly what his notes had described, dense and clean, and exactly what a rail line pushing through rough country needed for ballast and foundation work. Clara stood at the edge of the quarry operation one afternoon and watched the stone come up from the ground and thought about her grandfather kneeling on this hillside 20 years ago with his hand drill and his measuring rod pulling a core sample in the October cold and knowing what it meant. He had known. He had always known. The spring water was the other revelation, though Clara had been expecting it. Aldous Reeves arrived in April, a week after the rail crews started work, traveling from Pennsylvania, where he had been completing a geological survey contract for a mining company in the Allegheny Range. He was 31 years old, a quiet man with ink-stained hands, and the particular focused attention of someone who has spent most of his adult life looking at what other people walk past without seeing. He had trained under one of the same geologists whose work Samuel had studied. And when Clara showed him the first 3 notebooks, he spent an entire evening reading without speaking, turning pages with the careful hands of a man handling something valuable. He was trained in the Ohio survey tradition, Reeves said when he finally looked up. Yes, Clara said. There are maybe a dozen men alive who were trained that way and actually understood what they were doing. Most of them are still in Ohio. He looked back at the notebook. Where did he do his field work? Here, Clara said, for 30 years. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is remarkable work, Miss Holt. These estimates the water table mapping the mineral cross sections. This is publication quality geology done by a man working alone in Wyoming territory in the 1860s. He was remarkable," Clara said. They began the full survey of the water basin the following week, working methodically from the points Samuel had marked in his notebooks outward, using instruments more precise than anything Samuel had had access to, but finding that his estimates conservative, as he had labeled them, were accurate to a degree that Reeves found difficult to explain without simply attributing it to exceptional instinct. The basin was larger than Samuel had estimated. Not by a small margin. It was nearly twice the size of his most expansive projection, a freshwater source of sufficient volume and depth to supply a town 10 times the size of current Redstone for a century without meaningful depletion. The limestone filtration that fed it produced water of exceptional purity, clear and cold and tasting of nothing but itself. Clara filed the updated survey with the county land office in May, publicly, and without announcement, her name on every page. No frayed string, no quiet drawer. She filed it the way a person files something they intend to use openly and permanently because the time for waiting was done. The day after she filed, she went back to the cedar chest and opened it to the last notebook, the one Samuel had left in the smaller chest with his letter. She had read most of it already, the geological notes, the cross sections, the margin annotations in his careful hand. But she had not read the last 4 pages, because when she had reached them in April, shortly after the will reading, they had been sealed with a strip of plain paper gummed across the top, and Samuel had written across the seal in his small, precise script, "Not yet." She had waited. She had not always known what she was waiting for. But she had understood that Samuel's timing had never failed him, and she was not going to be the one to start doubting it now. She looked at the seal for a moment. Then she opened the notebook carefully and separated the pages along their natural fold and began to read. The writing was different from the rest of the notebook. The geological notes were precise and impersonal, the language of a scientist recording observations. This was different. This was Samuel talking directly without the mediation of technical language in the voice she recognized from 100 mornings on horseback. He had dated the pages. He had written them the winter before he died, 1883. The same winter he had given her the key to the cedar chest and told her she would know when to open it. The first page was a geological note, but not the kind she was used to. It was a synthesis pulling together everything he had learned over 30 years about the water table beneath Black Ridge Hollow and the limestone shelf and the drainage patterns of the northern tract. But it was drawn at a scale she had not seen in his other notebooks, not 40 acres, but the entire township. The entire geography of Redstone and the land around it seen from above, with water flows and geological formations marked across a 10-mile radius. And on the page, in the careful hand of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time, was a design. Not a map. A plan. A complete and detailed plan for a municipal water system serving the town of Redstone. Pipeline routes, pump station location, storage capacity, flow calculations. Everything drawn with the same precision as his geological surveys, which was to say, with the precision of a man who did not draw things he had not thought through completely. The pump station was positioned at the optimal point on the spring basin. The pipeline routes followed the grade of the land to minimize pumping requirements. The storage calculations were based on population projections that included a significant growth factor because Samuel had known that the railroad would bring people and he had planned for the people it would bring. At the bottom of the page, in the largest letters of anything in any of his 14 notebooks, he had written, "For when the town needs it. Clara will know when." She sat with those pages for a long time. Ash was at her feet, his chin on her boot, breathing slowly. Through the kitchen window, the spring light was coming off the ridge in long gold angles, the kind of light that makes Wyoming look like something out of a story. She thought about Samuel kneeling on the limestone above the hollow in every season for 30 years. She thought about him filing his claim in the land office in 1872, watching Mrs. Alderton stamp the document with the careful hands of a professional already building a structure that would not be used for a decade. She thought about him writing the letter to 13-year-old Clara and sealing it in a cedar chest and waiting 10 years to give her the key. She thought about how long he had been doing this, how many years of quiet, patient, deliberate preparation had gone into what looked from the outside like nothing more than an old man's sentimental gift to a granddaughter he was fond of. He had not left her 40 acres of rock. He had left her the future of the town. He had researched it, designed it, mapped it, and then trusted her to deliver it at the right moment. She stood up. She put the notebook in her coat pocket. She told Ash to stay, which he ignored, and walked out to the barn where Ridge was waiting with the patient attention of a good horse who has learned that her rider's moods are variable, but her intentions are usually interesting. Clara rode into Redstone and went directly to the mayor's office. Mayor Hendricks was a practical man who had been running Redstone's civic affairs for 7 years and who had recently been spending a great deal of his time thinking about water. Specifically about the fact that Redstone's current water supply, adequate for a town of 800, was going to become a serious problem when the railroad brought the growth that everyone in town was expecting and nobody had fully planned for. He received Clara without making her wait, which was either courtesy or calculation, or both, and he sat across his desk and looked at what she put in front of him. She had made a clean copy of Samuel's plan, transferring his notations to fresh paper in her own hand, organizing it in the order a mayor would need to read it, rather than the order a geologist would need to write it. She had added Reeves's updated survey data, the confirmed basin size and flow rate, and water quality results. She had attached the prior appropriation filing from the land office current and uncontested. She walked Hendricks through it in 20 minutes. He did not interrupt. He was a man who knew that the most useful thing you could do when someone was explaining something important was listen. And he listened the way Briggs had listened at the courthouse with full attention and no performance. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the plan on his desk. "This is your grandfather's work," he said. "The original design is his. The updated survey is mine and Aldous Reeves's. And you're offering this to the town." "The design, yes. No charge." She paused. "The water rights are mine. I will license them to the town at a fair rate reviewed every 10 years. I am not in the business of holding a town's water supply hostage to profit. But I'm also not in the business of giving away what I own. Those are two different things." Hendricks looked at the plan again. "You could have sold this to private interests, the Denver men. You had that offer." "I know." "Why didn't you?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Samuel's letter in the cedar chest. The land speaks to those who know how to be quiet. She thought about the hawk above the pass on that April morning, riding the thermal without effort, knowing exactly where the air was moving. "Because this is what it was built for," she said. "My grandfather didn't design a water system for private profit. He designed it for Redstone, It would be wrong to use it for anything else. Hendricks was quiet for a long time. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a thorough one, and Clara could see him working through the implications with the patient care of a civic administrator who understands that some decisions outlast the people who make them. There is one condition, Clara said. He looked up. My grandfather's name on the first pump station, Samuel Holt, wherever you build it. Wherever. Hendricks looked at her for a moment, then he looked back down at the plan, at the pump station position Samuel had marked with his careful hand on a winter evening in 1883, already knowing where it needed to be. That seems like the least we could do, he said. Clara rode home in the long summer evening, the light going gold and then amber on the ridge above Black Hollow. Ridge moved at her usual pace, steady and unhurried, picking the familiar trail without being told. Ash ran alongside, appearing and disappearing in the brush at the trail's edge, with the easy confidence of an animal that knew this ground completely. The summer moved on. The rail line pushed through the pass in August, the crews working with the precision that Crane's management always produced, and when the first locomotive came through the corridor on a Wednesday morning in early September, running a test run before the official opening, Clara stood at the high point above the pass and watched it move through the 22 feet of solid ground that Samuel had measured in another century. And she felt something that was not triumph and not vindication, but something older and quieter than both. Satisfaction, maybe. The satisfaction of a thing done right from the beginning by people who understood what they were doing. She thought about the men in the courthouse in April who had laughed. She thought about their faces when the news had spread through Redstone. She thought about the conversations that happened at the feed store and the saloon and the Sunday services, the careful reassessment of what Clara Holt had done and how she had done it and what it meant. People said she had been lucky. She heard it often at the general store, at the cattleman's dinner, where she was now invited to sit at the table she had never previously been considered for. That Clara Holt, they would say, shaking their heads with the mixture of admiration and bewilderment that people reserve for outcomes they cannot fully explain. Luckiest woman in Redstone inherited a pile of rocks and found the railroad underneath. She never corrected them. She had thought in the early months that she might want to lay out the notebooks on a table somewhere and trace the lines her grandfather had drawn and explain point by careful point how 30 years of deliberate, informed, patient preparation had produced what looked from the outside like luck. She had thought about showing people the letter Samuel had written when she was 13. The mineral filing from 1872. Mrs. Alderton's logbook entry. The last 4 sealed pages with their pump station design and their instruction Clara will know when. But she understood eventually why Samuel had never done that. He had understood something about the economy of explanation that she had to learn for herself. Correcting people about luck was a kind of spending. It cost energy and produced nothing. The land did not care what people called it. The contracts did not care. The water that came up cold from 30 feet below the surface of a hollow that everyone had written off as worthless rock did not care what name anyone put on its origin. Let them call it luck. The truth was quieter than luck and considerably more durable. The truth was an old man on a limestone ridge with a notebook in a precise hand and a 30-year view of the future. The truth was a girl sitting beside him on a flat rock 9 years old, asking questions and receiving answers she would not understand for another decade. The truth was patience of the active kind, not passive, not hopeful, but watchful and informed and absolutely certain of its own moment. She and Aldous Reeves were married in the spring of 1887 in the First Methodist Church of Redstone, in a ceremony that the pastor kept mercifully brief because both of them had told him clearly that they did not enjoy ceremony. They built a house on the northern tract, not large, but well-made stone foundation from the same limestone shelf that was going into the railroad's ballast, a porch that faced east toward the ridge where the morning light came first. Ash grew old in the way that dogs grow old when they have been well loved and well fed, and given useful work slowly and with dignity, his gray muzzle going white and his pace settling from a trot to a walk without any loss of attentiveness. He died in the winter of 1889 on a cold, clear night in January, lying by the stove in the house on the northern tract, his breathing going gradually quiet, while Clara sat beside him with her hand on his rough gray fur. She buried him under the cedar tree at the edge of the spring in the ground above the water that he had helped her find, the ground that Samuel had marked with an X and the word listen, the ground that had always been cold with the truth of what lay beneath it. The following spring, a gray dog with amber eyes appeared at the property fence line one morning, more coyote than hound, lean and silent and watchful. She looked at Clara with an expression of calm, absolute certainty, as if she had thought about this carefully and decided. Clara named her Cinder. Their first child, a boy, was born in 1888. They named him Samuel. He had his great-grandfather's love of maps from the time he was old enough to hold a pencil, spreading paper across the kitchen floor, and drawing the land around the house with the instinctive spatial understanding of someone who has inherited a particular way of seeing. Their second, a girl, arrived in 1891. They named her Ruth. She had her mother's patience, and as she grew, her maternal grandmother's sharp tongue, which Clara had never known, but which seemed somehow to have found its way down through the bloodline anyway. Clara taught them both to read the land. She took them on the same ride Samuel had taken her up into the hills above the northern tract, along the limestone ridges, down into the draws, where the vegetation told stories about the water below, and the rock formation told stories about what the land had been 1,000 years before anyone walked it. She stopped her horse at the places Samuel had stopped his and waited while they looked and asked them what they saw. "What are you looking for?" young Samuel asked, once 8 years old, sitting on the flat rock above the hollow. The same flat rock where his great-grandfather had sat, and his mother had sat, and the logic of the land had been slowly, patiently explained to a girl who was paying attention. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Something you can't see yet," she said. "But you will." She taught them the names of the geological formations. She taught them how to read a survey, and how to file a claim, and how to understand a contract before you signed it. She taught them about the Wyoming Territory, water laws, and how prior appropriation worked, and why it mattered. She taught them that land had two stories, the one on the surface that everyone could see, and the one beneath it that required patience and attention and the willingness to be still. She kept Samuel's notebooks in the cedar chest in the front room, all 14 of them, and she added her own beside them as the years passed. Leather-bound volumes filled with water flow records and mineral surveys and seasonal observations, and the careful documentation of a woman who had understood from the time she was 9 years old that knowledge written down was knowledge that survived. By 1902, the collection filled 2 shelves. Aldous cataloged them with the methodical precision he brought to all his work, and together they created a record of the Northern Territory that the County Land Office eventually adopted as its baseline geological reference for the entire region. The pump station opened in the spring of 1890. Mayor Hendricks gave a short speech at the dedication that was better than most civic speeches because he had the good sense to make it mostly about Samuel Holt and almost not at all about himself. The station was built at the exact point Samuel had marked in his design, the optimal position, above the spring basin where the elevation and the geology combined to minimize the energy required to bring the water to the surface. On the front of the building, cut into the limestone block above the main door, In letters 4 inches high were the words S. Holt, 1872. Not a monument, not a memorial, a datum point, the year the work began. Clara stood at the back of the crowd at the dedication and looked at those letters and felt the specific quiet that comes when something has been completed correctly, when a thing that was set in motion a long time ago by someone with a long view has finally arrived at the place it was always heading. She thought about Samuel at the land office in 1872. She thought about him on the ridge in October 1883, 6 months before he died, looking out at the light on the hollow and saying, "When someone wants what's underneath, and they will, sooner than you think." He had been right. He was always right about the land. Clara Holt Reeves died in February of 1921, 60 years old, in the stone house on the northern tract, in the room where she could hear the spring running beneath the ridge through the window she had asked Aldous to leave open. The winter had been mild. The last weeks had been quiet, filled with the particular peace of a life that has accomplished what it set out to accomplish, which is a peace that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with completion. Cinder's granddaughter, a gray dog with amber eyes, lay at the foot of the bed, the fourth in the line that stretched back to the half-starved animal that had appeared at a young woman's door 37 years earlier and decided to stay. She was breathing slowly. She seemed in the way of such animals to understand the weight of the hour. Aldous sat beside her, holding her hand. His own hands were mapped now with the lines of 40 years of field work, weathered and sure, the hands of a man who had spent his life looking carefully at the ground. Samuel was there no longer a boy, a territorial surveyor working for the Wyoming government. His great-grandfather's love of maps fulfilled in a career that Samuel Holt the elder would have recognized immediately and approved of. Ruth was there, her children with her, the 6-year-old girl who had already been through the cedar chest twice, and the 4-year-old boy who remained primarily interested in Cinder's granddaughter. The light through the open window was the thin, clean light of a Wyoming February morning, coming off the ridge at the low angle of winter, touching the stone floor the way it had touched it every morning for 34 years. Clara's last words were not the words of a woman making a speech. They were practical, direct, and entirely in keeping with who she had been for 60 years. "Don't sell the water," she said. They didn't. The Reeves family held the northern tract for another 40 years. The spring basin still flowed. The pass still carried rail traffic. The limestone shelf still yielded stone. The pump station with S. Holt, 1872, above its door still moved clean water through the pipes that ran beneath the streets of a red stone that had grown exactly as Samuel had projected into a town that needed every gallon. And in the county land office, in a drawer that still smelled of dust and cedar, the original filing of Samuel Holt sat beside the surveys of his granddaughter. 2 generations of careful observation bound together with plain string tied in the same kind of knot. The clause they had laughed at was the only one that mattered. In the West, patience was worth more than cattle. And what lay underneath was always the real story.